Hello and welcome to the Tortoise AI Summit. For those of you just joining us, I'm Alexi Mostras, one of the editors at Tortoise. I wanted to say, first of all, a huge thanks to our partners, Henkel X Ventures and Capita, for making this happen, and to all our speakers for joining us today. The summit has been convened today to mark the biannual refresh of Tortoise's Global AI Index, which is a really fascinating index, if you haven't seen it, measuring AI preparedness by country. So check it out. Now, for those of you who haven't been to a Thinking before, let me very quickly tell you about it. There are really two ways you can contribute, and please do so, because the central idea of a Thinking is that we hear from as many of you as possible and not just our panelists, good as they may be. So the two ways are, number one, if you go down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat box. Press the chat box and you can add your thoughts and expertise. And my colleague Basha, a fellow editor at Tortoise, will marshal some of these comments and refer them to me. And the second way you can do it is by going down and raising your digital hand. There's a grey box that you can press, and then I'll know that you want to interject yourself into the conversation, and I'll try and bring you in. Okay, so we've only got 45 minutes today to discuss a huge topic, and we've got no fewer than 5 absolutely fantastic guests, so I will get on with it. The topic we're talking about today is privacy and AI in the face of the pandemic. And many countries have turned to digital technology and to machine learning to enforce quarantines and implement restrictions on liberty. And the questions that arise from that are, is that technology proportionate to the health risk that COVID-19 offers? Can the networks that are being created now outlive the pandemic and potentially cause lasting damage to individual rights? How far should we accept that COVID-19 is such an exceptional situation that it does require a trade-off between health and privacy? Do we trust our governments to use these new powers responsibly? And towards the end of the discussion, if we look outside COVID-19, are we too focused on the possibilities and the benefits of AI and not on the associated privacy risks? So we've got a fantastic panel today. Prince Zeid Ra'ad, the former UN High Commissioner and an outspoken defender of human rights and civil liberties. Jan Tallinn, the founding engineer of Skype and a theoretical physicist who now studies existential risk, and he thinks AI is the biggest risk of them all. John Havens, director of the IEEE Global Initiative on the Ethics of Autonomous Systems. Carly Kind, the director of the Ada Lovelace Institute, and last but not least, Roger Taylor, the chair of the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation. Welcome all to this discussion. Prince Zeid, may I turn to you first? When I talked to you earlier, you said that you thought the discussion around contact tracing apps should focus not so much on efficacy or any of those other technical arguments, but on vulnerability. That the fact that some people are going to be placed in much greater jeopardy by contact tracing solutions should be the primary thing that informs the public debate. Can you just expand on that a bit, please?
Yes, absolutely, Alexi. First of all, I'm delighted to be joining everyone on this Think-In. I think the thought occurred to me that most of us have never experienced the sort of fear that an individual belonging to a vulnerable community, an indigenous activist in one of the South American countries, or an LGBTI lawyer in East Africa, or an albino in East Africa, an African descendant in most parts of the world, given the deep levels or the high levels of racism that and structural discrimination that they face. Most of us have not experienced this, and so we can be afforded the luxury of discussing variations of the sort of things you need to do, this sort of derogations of human rights law that one has to envisage are required for then ensuring that we somehow contain this awful pandemic. And here we have to be careful, because we may decide that it's easy for us to go ahead and say, okay, fine, let the state take some of my privacy rights as they're enshrined in Article 8 of the European Convention or Article 17 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It's okay, do it. But we have to also think of the millions, hundreds of millions of people for whom this, in the longer term, if these technologies remain, and they're most likely going to remain, what it would mean for them. And if they don't buy into this, then they won't buy into the solution that is being proposed for the pandemic either. And we could still have a major, major problem 5, 10, 12 years from now, let alone a complete loss of whatever remaining privacy rights that we have or we are exercising. Finally, Alexei, just a quick point. You know, this pandemic is not force majeure. This was caused through human bungling. It's a massive human failure. And governments have driven us into a cul-de-sac, off into a ditch. And you raised the question of trust. That is the material point. How much do we trust our governments to do the right thing? And if they want a centralized contact tracing approach, I would have to question it. In many, many countries, if we go a decentralized approach, which is, I think, where many of us would favor, and it would have to supplement, you know, human contact tracing, that's something I think at least we can look at, and where Apple and Google are at the moment, and Switzerland and a number of countries. So that's my initial salvo.
And what would happen, what would be your view if the British government, for instance, concluded that a centralized system of contact tracing would be significantly more effective than a decentralized one when coupled with other analog means of controlling contact tracing and controlling COVID-19? If they said at the same time, look, we're going to put in place measures to mitigate the data, we'll delete it all afterwards, but it is going to be centralized. Is that a turning point for you? Is that the thing that makes you go no?
Well, I've been fortunate enough to spend part of my life in the United Kingdom, and one is well aware that you have access to judicial redress. There's a Crown Prosecution Service, the High Courts. You can press your claims before them. I mean, but you know, let's think about it down the road. What would you feel like if you were a Muslim living somewhere in the north of England, and in 10 years' time, someone like Nigel Farage was the prime minister, or you had some version of UKIP as the party in power? I mean, would you feel comfortable that there's so much power concentrated in such a way with the central government? I mean, this is the reality for hundreds of millions of people around the world who can't feel secure and feel extreme fear. If you and I you know, in my former job as UN human rights chief, I came across them all the time, and this is where we need to place ourselves, I think, in mentally.
Do you worry, in the opening discussion of the summit, it was mentioned that trust in governments has increased and trust in technology has increased at the same time as fear is increasing as well. Do you think that there is a substantial risk that those factors will combine to cause people to give up privacy in exchange for health security, whilst not thinking about exactly the sort of people that you're mentioning now?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's completely normal. You know, when you're so fearful, you're apt to trust government, and especially strong government. But that lapses very quickly once certain measures are taken. Then, and human rights law allows for it, so long as it's proportionate and it's driven by necessity, and there is a sort of lawfulness about it. But then it needs to be unwound and unpackaged. That is very, very unlikely to happen. And we've seen this around the world when it comes to counterterrorism measures. There's always another reason why you need to keep it in place. And whatever trust you have now is a temporary sort of buoyancy for the sort of policies that governments are thinking about, that will disappear very quickly. And we've seen this time and again.
That's fascinating. I'm just going to, before I turn to Carly, I just wanted to raise a point that was made in the comments that absolutely fascinating from Sebastian Krier. He says, we're more comfortable with Google knowing our exact location 24/7 to tailor restaurant recommendations to us than the government rolling out a contact tracing app that could potentially save many lives. Carly Kind, are we treating what the government does in terms of privacy with a different set of rules than we apply to corporations? And if so, why are we doing that, and is that justified?
Interesting question. I think that the conversation, in fact, the focus on privacy in the conversation actually misses lots of the points here. And those points are to do with power and control, both by the state, but by tech companies as well. Zaid made the point there that we need to have a conversation about, does this type of technology work for everyone? Does it work for vulnerable groups as much as it works for the majority? But I think that there's a missed conversation here about something even more fundamental, which is, does it work at all? We come from the perspective that if technology can make lives better, if it can help the transition out of the pandemic faster and more efficacious, then we should use it. But there's a big question mark here about whether the type of proximity tracing that digital contact tracing apps enable is technically sound, works in practice, has positive behavioral implications. Those questions haven't been resolved yet. And obviously we need to work out a way to resolve them at pace in the context of a pandemic. And we need to work out how comfortable we are with various levels of uncertainty there, and what might the negative consequences be of forging ahead where there is uncertainty. So, for example, we don't yet know how the use of the app might cause people to relax their compliance with social distancing measures. How can we think about that, and what level of certainty do we need to get to that the use of the app will have positive behavioral implications before we roll it out? One of the big questions around technology policy is, do you enable the population to be subject to a beta test? You know, is it right, is it morally and ethically right to roll out an untested piece of technology on the population at large? And now we're trying to answer that question in the context of a pandemic with all of these very complicated factors. And I don't think we yet have the right solution to that. Some of the solutions involve process and things like ethics boards, and we're seeing this all being worked out real time in the context of the NHS contact tracing app, and there are critiques being leveled at that. And I would argue that we don't yet have the evidence to support that and contact tracing app can work at all, let alone work for vulnerable groups the way Zaid pointed out. And that's before you even really get to the questions of privacy at all.
But haven't you got a problem here? Because we're in a pandemic. It's obviously very time sensitive. People are dying. There's a huge time pressure to come up with a solution. So either you wait and you gather evidence as to whether a digital contact tracing system works, but potentially there's an opportunity cost to waiting, or you just plow ahead, but there's potentially negative consequences for doing that without the evidence. So in that very kind of depressing scenario, how do you think that the governments around the world should proceed, and how does that tie in with privacy?
Yeah, what you're getting at there, Alexi, is that there are trade-offs in speed versus efficacy versus public buy-in and public trust. And what we need to work out is what is the right balance of those various aspects. One way for sure to inform that conversation is is working in the open, so involving people in that process, being frank about the levels of uncertainty and the levels of risk. But also, I think nobody thinks that digital contact tracing is a silver bullet. It's not the vaccine that we're going to have to wait to for this problem to be solved writ large. It's one tool that can complement other measures to open societies. And it's a tool that we may have to rely on for some years, depending on how long it takes to get to a vaccine. Therefore, I think it's worth taking a little more time to make sure that that rollout works, and it works first time, in particular because contact tracing, digital contact tracing, is reliant on widespread public uptake in order to be effective. So we hear this number of 60% of the population or 80% of the smartphone users need to download and use this app in order for it to be effective. It must be the case that if a kind of half-baked solution is rolled out too soon, people may turn off that solution or be less likely to use it in the longer term, and we ruin our chance to use it over the course of 2 years or however long it takes us to get to a vaccine. So I don't think that speed, we kind of move ahead at speed at all costs here. There is a trade-off to be struck.
I suppose you know, even that question is fraught with difficulty, because if there are too many concerns around privacy raised about a contact tracing app, then fewer people would download it and it would become less effective. John, could I turn to you? Now, you've been studying existential risk for a number of years. You were one of the first people to really focus on it. And you've named AI and bio as the two things most likely to cause humanity an existential threat. I'm not sure how much read-through you see from COVID and the technology being employed to combat COVID to AI in general and the dangers of AI in general. But can you tell us a bit about what you think COVID-19 teaches us about existential threats and about how humanity might deal with them without sacrificing some of its democratic principles?
Right. So I think COVID crisis does bring like kind of new experience into the living memory of the species that like very few surviving people have, which is like what it means to have like a species-wide problem or species-wide crisis. And I do think that might be sort of like a silver lining that hopefully if we can kind of use this crisis as an example can be like a model for how to address potentially kind of bigger crisis. When it comes to privacy, I think there is like a genuine trade-off between security and privacy. Like one kind of way to see it is if you think about like an extreme case, like we will get like the power of our technology increases while the planet does not, meaning that if you kind of imagine like what the situation would be if we had like radical proliferation of nuclear weapons in a way that like everybody can do those in the garage, what do you think the world would look like? Like would be like it's kind of, it feels that we should be kind of sacrificing some of our privacy in order to actually kind of extend the expected lifetime of the civilization. Of course, like there is clear, I would just like add to the refrain that there being trade-offs. The problem with the privacy is it's like a currency. If you kind of give it away, you will like, you have the potential to purchase added security, but it's like, but the people or like the system, the structure that will do the purchasing act is not necessarily you. You have to like trust the system to put that loss of privacy to good use. And I do think that being from Estonia, I think that the smaller countries kind of have inherent advantage because there is like a closer distance to the government, to the kind of institutions, both in like literal geographic terms, but also like social network wise. Therefore, like it's kind of easier to hold the kind of powers that be more accountable. And I do think that accountability is like really important part of the equation here. So one of the institutes that I support, Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, they have this concept called structured privacy. And the idea there is to think about if you really need some systems that reduce people's privacy, can we do that in a way that doesn't increase kind of power differentials or basically at the same time introduces some kind of constraints into the system that loss of privacy cannot be abused.
What kind of power differentials are you talking about?
Oh, general ones. Like there are kind of higher status people. There are people closer to the power, and people who are more vulnerable indeed. So like you can kind of think about look at people and think about like how if there would be sort of increased increased transparency in society, like who would benefit? Would they be in a position to abuse that or not? So if there would be ways to introduce privacy using kind of decentralized ways or some advanced cryptographic techniques, differential privacy, etc., that are really being researched right now, which is really interesting, then it's possible, could be that it's possible to introduce kind of privacy loss in a way that doesn't necessarily hurt people. For example, as far as I know, in Estonia, our e-health system has this feature that everybody, including doctors, can check everybody's health records, etc. But there's always a trace that's left. So, like in some ways, like I have the potential to lose my privacy, but if the system works properly, I will know if somebody infringes on my privacy, and that's an important accountability measure.
Just before we come to the other guests, I want to see whether Sophie Ignatidou, I probably pronounced that very wrongly, can we bring her up on the screen? She's making a really interesting point about privacy and security. So hold on, let's see if we can do it. If not, we can go to John Havens. John, your whole your institute is centered around exploring ethical considerations of AI. How do you apply ethics to how machine learning can help combat COVID-19?
Sure. First of all, good morning. And second of all, I should say IEEE is actually a very large organization. So I'm executive director of a smaller program in the Standards Association and speak for myself versus all of the institution or all of IEEE. Second of all, I just had to say this because it's always fun in these talks to see people's backgrounds. Roger Taylor, I so admire your vinyl collection and I'm envious. I'm just saying. And I also should say your IM chat, congratulations to Alexandra. Your IM chat is brilliant. I'm kind of distracted because I'm reading everyone's great comments. And actually, I'll start with Sophie. I know you couldn't bring her up, but I love her question. And she says it much better than I probably will because I'm still waking up. But the false dichotomy of privacy versus security, I just want to touch on that because I think it focuses on ethics in the sense of thinking about control and access. And also, I was really honored, and forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Zayed, but starting from a human rights standpoint, I want to ask this question, which I often ask. A lot of times people say with privacy, in terms of digital issues, what have you got to hide? That question so bugs me. And I love thinking about the future. We're in this horror of COVID. How about we ask the question, what is ours to reveal, right? We haven't talked about all the wonderful ways from a sovereign data standpoint. And let me just get these things out of the way. Can any solution be hacked? Yes. Is it hard to teach people about taking care of their privacy and their data? Yes. But fundamentally, what are we all doing right now on this call? We are all in an immersive reality. When augmented reality, virtual reality, gaming comes into play, especially with regards to our kids, and a primary focus for us, I'm a dad, and I think for anybody these days is thinking about their children. What does their kids' life look like in 5 years? We have been tracked for so many years for good purposes in terms of brands and whatever else. What coffee do I like, etc. But we have not been taught. And by the way, I humbly bow to Jan and Estonia. Estonia is such an amazing model to look at. I understand it's European. I understand it's a smaller country. Nonetheless, the work that they've done there is remarkable. And I think Jan just put it perfectly. And Jan, forgive me if I get this wrong. But if we want to think that privacy means absolutely nothing about me is ever sort of left, no piece of identity is left that other people can't access, then we're also using terminology from a status quo that is no longer here. And what a beautiful opportunity, along with what Prince Zayed said, about recognizing that if people have access to their data and portability of their data. It gives them a control where they will still be tracked, but they can also raise their hand and say, hey, I'm being tracked in all these different ways, but I am the only John Havens on the world, according to these identity structures, centralized or not, and there's issues there, of course. But this is what I say about my data. And in a future COVID situation, John will get to say, I want to assist in giving X amount of data to help trace or help anything else. So I just want to fundamentally say, what a wonderful opportunity, if that's not ironic to say, because of course, the primary thing here is how do we keep people from being sick and dying? But what a wonderful opportunity to teach everyone, you are your data. Your identity is you. And if we frame it that way, then the whole conversation about it's going to be hard for people to get trained about their data becomes much different. When people say, frame yourself and think now about how this data can be shared in a way that allows you some aspect of control.
And how do you think that control should be guaranteed? Should there be legislation either on an international or a national basis that says, for example, data can only be collected for certain specific purposes, or do you have some sort of retrospective duty that subjects both governments and companies to audits? I think what people might be worried about is a situation where you prima facie get given control over your data on day one, and then something changes 10 years later, 5 years later, as Zaid said, there's a new government and suddenly they've got your data, but you no longer have control over it. So I guess the question would be, how do you control for a future change in circumstances?
That's a great question. And I guess in one sense, is there absolute control for anything in the future? So, no. For us at IEEE, or for our work, we have a couple of sort of, I'll call it lines in the sand. And here again, I want to thank the UK, the ICO, I'm going to get this wrong. Again, forgive me, I'm waking up. The Commissioner's Office and the amazing work of Baroness Beeben-Kidron in terms of securing children's data rights. I'm speaking just for myself as John, but as a dad, I think a great place to ask some of these questions, and again, Zaid talked on this beautifully, is where are the people that we need to protect, where we don't really have these, or in one sense, do we need to have these conversations? Would someone say that a 13-year-old, a 12, an 11, a 10-year-old child should have their data be accessed in ways where they might be at risk for trafficking, right? Are there any sort of absolutes from a values-based standpoint that we can all probably point to and say, even if we don't all agree on the exact age, do we fundamentally protect our kids so that now, not the future, now, our digital identities, also our kids, are much more, depending on the situation and the person, broad and in depth than our, quote, real selves. And so training kids, and you've probably read this for years, kids can be born with a personal data store, as it were, where they and their parents are shepherding and curating their data while they're also being tracked. Because the short answer is that, who knows, governments may change, but then you have that central data. And I should say for IEEE, a huge part of our work is standards. I'm part of the Standards Association. And standards for IEEE are free to join. You don't have to be a member. And also when a standard is released from IEEE, it's open, all the standards. It's not a formal legal instrument per se. It's what most people call soft governance. And so for us, a big paper we created called Ethically Aligned Design inspired about 14 working groups, many of which are focused on standards. And again, I bow to the amazing Doc Searles, and I've been part of the personal data sovereignty kind of ecosystem for years. And he helped us inspire to create one of our standards, which may be aspirational, but the focus is on giving every human personal data or privacy terms and conditions for themselves. Think about how this conversation would be different. And I know it's aspirational, but if every human were taught and given when they were born terms and conditions that they can say to the digital and algorithmic world, this is me based on my culture, not just the West, the East, the global South, right? Ubuntu ethics frames the community first, before myself in Africa. that doesn't mean that you still don't have a passport, for instance, right now, right? There are tools where everyone could be given sort of a basic level of coming into the immersive reality that we're already a part of. And of course, like I said, things can be hacked, governments will change.
Okay.
Fundamentally, yeah.
Sorry, no, I'm just conscious of the time, and we've got to we've got to hear from some of these amazing audience members as well. But before we turn to that, I just want to talk to Roger Taylor, who's the chair of the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation. Hi, Roger. I can see that John is right, that vinyl collection is looking pretty good. I'm not saying that this is your view, but I just wanted to ask you whether you agree that that there is a danger here that if we become too focused rigidly on privacy concerns when designing machine learning or technology to combat COVID-19, that we could shoot ourselves in the foot by rendering it ineffective, whilst at the same time more authoritarian regimes who are less concerned about these sort of debates that we're having today press ahead and actually deal with the disease better. And where do you think the line is, both in terms of COVID, but also wider in between effectiveness on the one hand and privacy on the other?
So yes, my view would be that it is absolutely right to focus on the privacy concerns. I think what I would say, however, is just as, there's a lot of discussion about the dangers of allowing particularly government or public services to use personal data and the risk that that is abused. I am also concerned about the risk that, particularly in democratic countries, governments fail to use data in ways that citizens would want them to use it for their benefit, because ultimately we don't believe we can build systems that we trust. And just to sort of bring out a few principles there, underpinning that. I mean, I think it's very important that we don't set as a benchmark that we shouldn't use technology because there is a risk of abuse. If something is inherently abusive, we certainly shouldn't use it. But the analogy of police forces is always a good one to think about. Police forces, I don't think there's any country where police forces have not abused rights. There are obviously countries where they are systematically used to abuse rights. They are difficult things to control and manage well, but that does not mean we would all be better off without police forces. A second issue I think we really need to sort of work, in terms of principles, is to recognize that, as it were, loss of privacy is not the same as invasion of privacy. So I lose privacy in my relationship with my wife, with my doctor, my children, with their teachers. But that is not necessarily an invasion of privacy if that's a beneficial thing and I trust that relationship. What we have in terms of the relationship between citizens and the state is a very significant trust deficit at a time when the states need their citizens to trust them. And if they can't, they will lose the ability to do beneficial things. And the pandemic highlights this in very, very clearly. Just a couple of other points, if I could, just to say that in when we assess the risks of data use and the degree to which it can be trusted versus the benefits that could come from it, there's obviously, quite rightly, there's a very detailed technical discussion about technical mechanisms of protecting people's privacy, institutional mechanisms, legal mechanisms, and the need, as Carly pointed out, to rigorously assess whether it's actually useful. But it's worth also saying that most people obviously could not possibly learn enough and find out enough about every possible application. They are going to have to trust institutions. We've got to have a legal and institutional framework that people can trust. And it very much brings in the point about individual data rights and how they operate, particularly in a context where governments do have, in pandemic situations or security situations, rights to information from people as well. And perhaps just as a sort of an illustration of where we got to, this debate about centralization and decentralization of contact tracing acts is quite interesting. Most countries looking at this are wrestling with the same problem, which is that the public are saying, if this is going to help, you should definitely do it. But there's also a public dialogue, which is, we're not sure we can really trust the government to do this. It's worth stressing as well, there's been a lot of discussion about the Apple-Google thing, and in the UK it's sometimes characterised that the UK is a bit of an outlier. It is worth stressing that most countries are using centralised systems, because there's and the argument being put forward, I mean, you might be sceptical of it, but there is good reason at this stage to believe that there are significant benefits in the reliability and the quality of mechanism you can provide using a centralised system. It's also worth saying that the UK has gone with a very anonymous system. And most countries are being less anonymous because you can do more. If you have the person's phone number, you can then integrate that with real-world contact tracing. The question about, key question here is, will people follow the advice given by an app? Now, you could build an app that let you know that, but we've chosen not to do that, and instead we're going to have different systems. So there's a real risk here that we do things that are less effective because we don't believe we can be trusted.
I just want to, before we turn to the audience, can I just come back to John, please? I want to pick up something that Roger said about the decentralized versus centralized debate. So centralized contract tracing systems, let's assume that they are more effective. And at the moment, because of the emergency, you have a great kind of public groundswell of opinion that just says, if it's there as a technological solution, please use it. And I wonder whether you worry that people are, even before COVID, not that good at seeing out 50 years or 60 years and seeing long-term threats, and that COVID has kind of exacerbated this problem and made everyone focus on a solution that has to be applicable right now without thinking about the long-term effects of it. How would you see the decentralized, centralized debate in terms of the potential long-term threats of a centralized model?
So, I mean, having designed software, both centralized and decentralized peer-to-peer software, I think it's a sort of almost a fact that it's just much easier to design centralized systems and much easier to debug them and ensure that they are correct. Now, that also kind of implies that it's hard to actually roll out decentralized systems that have like hard constraints, quickly roll out decentralized systems that have hard constraints about their performance. Therefore, depending how long this crisis will last, I think the majority of the systems that will be used will be centralized just because of this software development constraints. But I do hope that they're also, I don't think it's very practical to sort of try to push people who are, many of them are in kind of crisis mode, to try to address kind of long-term concerns. I'm certainly being kind of trying to hold myself back. I do think it's valuable to still think about, once this crisis is over, can we look back to it and see what are the lessons that we learned and how to generalize them for the next crisis that might be more substantial, and can we kind of prepare, can we use this fact that now we know that these things happen to our species, can we use that fact to actually develop systems while not in crisis mode in order to be better prepared for the next crisis?
Okay, fantastic. Can I bring up, please, Yasmin, who has made a couple of really interesting comments in the chat. Is Yasmin there? Okay. If not Yasmin, then maybe Maria. Is Maria around?
Yes, hello everyone. Amazing panel, and I think we can continue like this for the rest of the afternoon.
We could, yeah.
John and I are lucky enough to work on a series of initiatives around AI for children. And although it's very reassuring to see UNICEF and World Economic Forum investing quite a lot in those initiatives, I still think we're not paying close attention. We don't think that trying to understand how this technology impacts our children right now and the way they are growing up in an automated society, we pay enough attention. And I think my reflection, and probably a question for all to go back, is how do we make it a priority? How do we bring together conversation about reforming the education system, as we've heard in the previous session, with how really children are growing differently than before, and how technology that have been developed not with children in mind, like the apps we're using, the technology there is around their school, the hospital, the streets, and there's still a lot we don't understand how those technology impact children. So I wonder what can we do for the government and the policymaker to take this issue seriously.
And what kind of technology, in terms of the technology that children are exposed to, are you most concerned about? And why are you concerned? Is it a question of them giving up their data when they're too young to know what they're giving up? Can you just expand on the point a little bit?
Of course, that's one of the, yes, of course, the data privacy, the children data privacy. I think John can cover it a little bit better with the work he's doing with IEEE. Also thinking about the impact on raising children around voice assistant and Alexas and Siris, and how well we understand the way their personality are being shaped by interacting with self-learning machines. And we're not just talking about toys or devices that have been developed with children in mind. Because I think most of the companies that are doing work in this field are paying close attention. I'm talking about the ones that are gradually surround children in their own lives, and also the facial recognition technology, right? We start deploying in public spaces where children do spend their lives. And we don't understand how capturing the biometric data of the children now will fundamentally impact their lives and their fundamental rights in the future. I don't think enough research is being done by in this field. There are very few researchers out there around the world who actually study the interaction between children and autonomous self-learning systems.
I wonder whether I could put that point to Zaid. Do you think that AI, when applied to the younger generation, will or could have a positive influence in terms of combating the things that you've spent years fighting against, bigotry, fundamentalism, or without the proper regulation, could it go the other way?
It's a very good question. It deserves a very actually complex response, because look, given the amount of fiscal spending that's taking place now, this next generation is going to be paying our debts, literally our debts, for the next 50 years. There would be unemployment crunches where they won't find jobs. They will be, they will realize their vulnerabilities. It's just coming. I think the question is very well put, because there's a seductiveness to technology and the requisite thoughtfulness that many of the panelists have spoken about that's required when it comes to the engineering, but not just the engineering, the oversight, the regulatory bodies and governments themselves. I mean, my view on this is that yes, technology can be value neutral in the beginning, or it starts off science very much as value neutral, and then must be guided by an ethical hand underpinned by law. And what we have is a backdrop where everything is sort of collapsing, and don't forget, COVID-19 is a symptom of this sort of intergovernmental collapse. A very serious public health crisis in China has become a pandemic. It should not have been. We could have stopped this. It's not force majeure, and there will be an accounting, and there's a lot of responsibility that would have to be accepted. But I think it goes back to this business of trust, and then we will trust that we can give up more of our rights. But I think there is a vulnerability when it comes to children that we do need to accept. Incidentally, just on the issue of facial recognition technology, I find it amazing now that with the fact that we're all wearing surgical masks in public, we've more or less destroyed it, at least as a public utility, in one go. So now in China, of course, it threw them into disarray, and for that reason they've moved now, to the Alipay system in Hangzhou, where you have a QR code and you can't go anywhere unless you get the right color. But it's just amazing how these things can shift so suddenly. But it's a very good question, and I only wish we had more time to ponder it deeper and give a better response than I've just done.
No, not at all. I think I agree. It's the sort of thing that we could talk about for ages, and even can if you go to the green room after this event. Before I sum up very briefly, I just want to come to Yasmin because she has 5 rules that she employs before she downloads any app, and I really want to know what they are.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. So my colleagues and I put together this little list, and the first thing is this app effective? And I think somebody from the Ada Lovelace Institute already talked about this, and it's a really important question. Do we think this app is effective at what it's supposed to be doing? And that question is still up for grabs. Question number 2 is, do you trust the government? And, you know, depending on the person that you are in the world, maybe you do trust the government. But as a Black Muslim woman, you know, the UK government hasn't been great for me. So that answer is a bit shady. Number 3 is, do we demand better privacy regulations? Now, in whatever country, and I know Tortoise has done a really good summation of the different privacy regulations in different countries, but are they clear in the area and the jurisdiction that you're downloading the app in? And do you think that you deserve more? Number 4 is, do you want to contribute to negatively impacting human rights? And I know there has been some discussion around this, but broadly, any increase in surveillance and normalizing of surveillance negatively impacts human rights unless it's thought through deeply. And if you're rushing legislation through, if you're rushing an app through, perhaps that's not something that's more move fast and break things than getting it right. And question number 5 is, are you willing to contribute to the construction of a surveillance state? And the reality is that here in the UK, we are already living in, although people might not think of it as a surveillance state, there are lots of elements of that. And the more that we increase and normalize surveillance, the more that we contribute to the broader construction of a surveillance state. And mass surveillance has never been good for the people.
Thank you so much. Right, we've got well, -1 minute, and so I'll do a very, very quick summary of an amazing discussion. I only wish we had more time. What has come out of it really for me is that trust is at the center of almost every debate around privacy, whether related to COVID-19 or otherwise. Not only in terms of, do we trust who is implementing the particular piece of technology, whether it's a corporation or a government, but do we trust a potential future corporation or government that might have control over the data in 10 years' time? It's important in relation to COVID and contact tracing, not only to look at utilitarian equation on how many people could have their lives bettered by a particular app, but you've got to look at the people on the fringes as well, the vulnerable people that could really lose out if their health data was tracked. And also, the other point I think that was made very strongly by Carly in particular, as well as others, is that efficacy of the app is very important, or of technology is very important. We shouldn't just fall back on techno-solutionism, which is a great term that I read about only yesterday, when there may be more analog, safer solutions to use in place. Privacy is a currency. I liked John's point about that, and about how privacy is treated as kind of country dependent, and smaller countries, it's easier to hold the governments to account. There were differing views on whether there is automatically a trade-off between privacy and security, and some people made quite convincing arguments that there shouldn't be that dichotomy. I think Roger made a very interesting point when he said that we shouldn't allow a risk of abuse to transfer into an idea that we should never experiment or innovate or use technologies. And the comparison with the police force was interesting. We're going to have more and more debates about not only COVID-19 and the centralization versus decentralization, but AI in general and its impact on democratic processes and on us all. I hope that you can continue this debate in the green room afterwards. The next Think-In will start at midday. So we're going to go dark for 10 minutes, grab a coffee before we kick things off. If you're a Tortoise member, you can continue all these conversations. You can network with everyone on this call. Basha will share a link in the chat. And if you're not, then join up. It's free for 30 days. And the link will also be posted in the chat. So it just remains for me to say thank you so much to an amazing panel and to all the people that commented and contributed. And have a great day.